Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Dietzler, Director of Education and Events for Trade Press Media Group, and I really appreciate you all joining us today for the webcast, Why It's the Perfect Time to Install a Wind Turbine to Power Your Facilities. Our presenter today is Paul Dawson, Business Development for EWT Americas. Paul is a seasoned business development and strategy professional in renewable energy. His previous roles include vice president at EO Cycle Technologies, and he's also served as sales manager with both Northern Power Systems and NRG Systems. He is adept in finances, market expansion, and strategic planning. We're going to hear about all of those aspects today. And our learning objectives for our webcast today include the benefits of distributed wind energy and why it perfectly fits with C&I facilities. We want to talk about how to know if distributed wind energy is right for you and your facility. We want to learn about grant money and incentives for these projects to help get them off the ground, and also discover the easy steps to explore the viability of these wind projects. So before we get into all that, let's go over a few housekeeping details. We do encourage audience questions. Paul is ready to answer them. And what you'd like to do is just hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen, navigate to that Q&A button and type in the questions. We'll get to as many as time permits, and we will probably hold most of them towards the conclusion of the presentation. But go ahead and enter them as they come to you. At the conclusion of our webcast today, we're going to send you a PDF copy of today's presentation slides, an archive of the presentation, and also a link to an online assessment. After you successfully complete that, you'll receive a CEU certificate. So watch your email for all of that. We're also going to archive this webcast at facilitiesnet.com/webcast, so you can go back and watch it again. I think it's time for the presentation, so I will now pass it over to Paul. Welcome.
Thank you, Wendy, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here and talk about an exciting topic, why it's the perfect time to install a wind turbine at your facility. And honestly, it really has never been a better time. There are some very exciting changes in the market, technology and incentives that I'll talk about that will let you know a little bit more about why that exactly is the case. I will note that from an incentives perspective, I will be focusing primarily on US incentives. So for those of you that are joining from abroad, I apologize for that section. There are still many other parts that will be relevant in terms of how this works and the concept, and it still certainly can be applicable, but those incentives may be different. Okay. So to get started, let's talk about what distributed wind is. What does it mean to generate your own power? So generating your own power can be done in a couple of ways. One, it can be done in a remote setting, off-grid type of situation, but more commonly, and we do both of these, but more commonly, you are connected to the grid, even though you're generating your own power. And the way that works is you connect your wind turbine, or in fact, it could be other technologies as well. It can be or a combination of them, solar, batteries, and wind. And the way that works is when your wind turbine is generating power, the wind is blowing, and it's producing electricity. It sends that power to your facility. Your facility has a certain power need at that moment. If it can use all of the power that is being produced, it will take that power first. And any additional power that is required will be purchased from your electric utility. In the inverse scenario, the wind is blowing, the wind turbine is spinning, and it's producing more power than your facility needs in that exact moment. The facility will take all the power that it needs, in fact, so its entire electric needs in that moment, and the excess generation from the wind turbine will be pushed back onto the grid and sold at a price that is determined by the policy of your electric utility. Now, typically, the amount of revenue that you get from selling the power back to the grid is lower, in some cases quite a bit lower, than the value of the power that you're using when you use on site, and you're replacing the power that you would buy otherwise. Because of that, it's quite important to try to match your renewable energy generation, so in this case, the wind turbine size and the production of that wind turbine, to match the energy needs of the facility. And that's something that we help our customers with. But as a general concept, this is something that you do want to keep in mind. There are turbines of different sizes. You can get different amounts of solar panels and so on to do that. And reducing, now, of course, the idea here is that in reducing and replacing what you buy from the utility, you'll be saving money in doing so, because the cost to produce electricity from the wind turbine is typically significantly lower than the price that you're paying to buy it from your utility. And exactly how much that is depends on the wind resource at your site and what you pay now as a comparison point. So that's the concept. Let's go now to why you would do this, right? So we already talked about, one, you save money, and paybacks right now can be extremely interesting. I'll show you some samples later, but we're talking in the matter of 5 years or less on a 25-year life. So you're talking about a heck of a lot of free power for a long time. The other reason to do that is to hedge against inflation, right? So when you're purchasing a wind turbine, one way to think about it is you're pre-buying your electricity for the next 25 years. Because most of the cost of that investment is purchasing the turbine. There is an ongoing operations and maintenance cost, relatively very small. So you're primarily spending your money upfront, and that's where you're caught, and then you're getting your production for the life of that turbine. So you're really locking in your rates and protecting yourself from inflation, especially of electric rates, which in many parts of the country now have seen, actually in many parts of the world have seen some extreme inflation. And so this is one way to protect yourself against that. Another benefit is that you're moving towards being completely energy independent. Again, as I was saying in the first slide, you are still connected to the grid. So this is not a typical scenario. You're not operating your system independently, but you're certainly getting much closer to that. And lastly, of course, you're reducing your carbon footprint, which is of course the objective of many organizations these days, and that's kind of an obvious one. But these are the 4 main buckets for that. So how big are these wind turbines, right? This is a question I often get. Well, it really depends on the wind turbine model. And again, that is matched to your size needs. In our case here, just for a point of reference, we built this little chart and put this image to give you some sense of things. If you've seen a wind farm out there, sometimes it's hard to get a sense of the scale, but they are huge. They're now over 500 feet. Our wind turbine at a rated power that's typically about 1/3 to 1/5 of those large wind turbines is about typically 225, 275 feet tall, which is about 69 or 84 meters. So it's kind of a medium size, if you will. And that's much easier to fit into the landscape. It'll be a lot less obtrusive visually than the wind farms, which not only are much larger, but also there are typically more of them. And what I should have mentioned earlier on, actually, is that in a typical scenario, you are looking at a single wind turbine that's matched with your electric load. You can put multiple turbines. It's something we do evaluate, and there are circumstances where that makes sense. But a typical project is a single wind turbine. Where does this work? How do you know if you've got the good wind? Well, we can help you with that. However, here's a wind map to give you a guide as to where that works. There is one area of the country, in a pretty large area, where the wind blows quite strongly and quite consistently, and that's the wind belt, which is essentially down the middle of the country. So through the Great Plains and into the Midwest, the wind resource is strong to world class. And so if your business is located in that area, it's almost certain that the wind resource is interesting and there's a lot of energy to be extracted from that wind. If you're located in another part of the country, then it's a little bit more of a case-by-case basis. In this map, the windy areas are represented by the most windy areas are represented by the red. And so if you take a look at the map, you can see that there is red in multiple locations and some yellow, which is just a little bit less strong than red. It's still pretty good. So again, it's a case-by-case basis, and it's just something then we would take a look at with our high-resolution data and be able to give you a better sense of whether your business or that location is a good one to leverage wind. Let's jump into incentives. All right, so there are some incentives that are making these projects in the U.S. extraordinarily attractive, and this has never been seen before at this level of incentive. And frankly, I don't expect that we'll ever see it again. It'll taper off. And so let's go over why that's really interesting. The Inflation Reduction Act came out 2022 from Congress, and they instituted a 30% tax credit on the full cost of a project. Okay, there was a tax credit prior. It had been phasing out. It actually was down to zero in projects like ours. It's now up at 30% and locked in there for several more years. So that is absolutely fantastic. So 30% of your project in a tax credit is available. In addition to that, there are 10% adders that can be stacked on top of that if your facility is either located in an area defined as an energy community or a low-income community, which is a specific definition, specific map. Like, it's as simple as looking it up on the map. In our case, we do that for you. So you can take your 30% tax credit and potentially turn it into a 40 or 50% tax credit if you're in the right location, which is just obviously extremely interesting from a payback perspective. A couple other things that came out in this incentive is a direct pay option. So if you're not a tax-paying entity, the federal government will now issue you a check for the equivalent value of that tax credit. So there is now the full ability for schools and other organizations of that nature to benefit from this incentive. If you are a tax-paying entity, but you don't have the tax liability, the credits can now be sold. This is a new piece, which is very exciting. So there's a market that's developing for that as well. So you can still leverage those tax credits. The tax credits, though, can be carried forward. So if you don't have the tax liability in year one, because it is substantial, it can be transferred for many, many years forward, 20 years forward. So there's no issues in terms of losing it there if you can't use it in the first year and you don't feel like selling it. I will note, so I noticed that some of the individuals who sign up for this webinar were from Canada. Canada does have a 30% tax credit that was released in the federal budget last spring, but it has not been put into law yet. So we are still waiting on that to happen. It will be very similar, I believe, to the tax credit in the US. Of course, details are to follow. They haven't rolled it out yet, but it looks like it's on its way. So that for Canadians on the line, that's something that you can look forward to. So in the US, in addition to your 30% or 30 to 50% tax credit, there's another program that you can stack on top of this if you qualify, that can get you up to 50% of the project cost, or capped at $1 million, which is in our case would be with our wind turbines would be the case, and stack that on top of your tax credits. This is a program put together by the U.S. Department of Agriculture called the REAP program, Rural Energy for America. It's specifically for agricultural producers, as you might expect, but also for rural small businesses. And that is defined very specifically rural areas with less than 50,000 inhabitants. There's a way to look that up. Again, we can help you with that to see if your business is in a rural area and therefore qualifies. And to be a small business as well, there's a specific definition. Again, that's why the SBA, something that we can look up based on your SIC codes, business, and we're able to determine if you do qualify as a small business. So assuming that now many businesses do qualify for that if they're located in rural areas, that is the case, then you can go after this money, which is stacked on top of your tax credits. So we're talking here, in our case, you can be looking at 80 to 90% of your project cost covered, which is just absolutely astonishing and amazing. This is unique in terms of this program right now, that the incentive is at 50%. It used to be at 25%. There were some additional funds as part of that Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, 10 times the normal funding for this program. However, that additional funding is going to be used up this year. So if you are thinking about looking at a wind energy project, I would certainly encourage you to do that now and potentially apply for that money. You don't have to use it right away, but certainly these are the golden days of incentives. So it would behoove you to look at it sooner rather than later. Let's put some real numbers on this. All right. Here is a facility in Iowa with an approximate electric bill of about $30,000 a month. In our case, our wind turbines at 1 megawatt rated power are best suited or best matched for businesses that have electric bills of maybe $5,000 a month, but more likely $10,000 a month or more. So in this case, at $30,000 a month, they certainly consume more than enough electricity to be a good match for the production of our wind turbine, which in this case, based on the wind resource in that area, would produce 2.8 million kilowatt hours per year. Project CapEx was just about $3 million, and the operating expenses was $40,000 a year. That is a operations and maintenance program that is administered by us. It is, in our case, it's a fixed fee that includes the scheduled as well as the unscheduled maintenance. So it's very predictable. There's no variability in that cost from your perspective. That amount is fixed every year. This facility was paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour at that time, and I assumed for the purpose of the financial modeling that there would be 4% inflation for the next 20 years. From an incentive perspective, they got the 30% tax credit that I talked about, and they qualified for the low-income community tax credit. So it was a 40% tax credit, which is $1.2 million. When we look at the results, which I'm sure you guys have noticed, right now we're looking at a payback of under 5 years, 19% annual return on your investment, and a project lifetime benefit of over $9 million. So that's the amount of savings that we're talking about. Levelized cost of energy, that is essentially the cost of producing a kilowatt hour of power from the wind turbine. And the way we calculate that very, very simply is to look at the lifetime cost of ownership, which again, as I described earlier, is almost exclusively the upfront investment to purchase and get it installed, but including your lifetime maintenance, divide that by the lifetime energy production, discounted for inflation, and you get your result. So in this case here, we're looking at 3-cent power, 3.3 cents versus the 10 cent that they're paying today, and of course, 10 cents will go up over time, but 3.3 cents is locked in for the life of the project. So that's how you end up with $9 million in your pocket. Here's another scenario, but if it qualifies for the REAP grant, here's what happens. All right. So we went from 3.3 cents. So the REAP grant, sorry, so the REAP grant, as a reminder, is 50% of the project cost up to $1 million. In this case, given the project is $3 million, it's capped. It reaches the $1 million cap. So we're looking at 1.2 million of incentives, as we saw in the previous example, and throw on the REAP grant on top. So 2.2 million out of $3 million investment is recovered in these incentives. That drops your cost of energy from 3.3 cents to 2.1 cents, even cheaper, halves the payback, and improves your IRR and the lifetime benefits. So it's it just gets, you know, almost silly. It's too hard. It's just unbelievable. It's so good. So let's talk about technology for a little bit, and especially how wind as a technology compares to solar, right? So these days, there's a lot of solar out there. Solar is great. We have nothing against solar. In fact, wind turbine can be a great complement to solar, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Well, the first thing is in terms of just differences. Let's take a look at that. First big difference between solar and wind is the amount of land that is required to get the same amount of energy production. All right. So first of all, wind is much more, if it's sited properly at a windy site, wind produces about 1.5 times to 2 times the amount of solar does for the same power rating. So more efficient, I guess we could say it in that sense. And then from a space perspective, a wind turbine really doesn't take much space at all. In our case, we're talking about a foundation that's about 60 feet wide. And in the case of solar, we're assuming you would need to go with the scenario where you need 2 megawatts of solar to produce the same amount of electricity as 1 megawatt of wind turbine. You're looking at about 8 to 10 acres of land, okay, versus your 60-foot foundation. So for commercial, industrial facilities, there is often not that kind of land available. Not to mention that financially, where there's a good wind resource, wind tends to have better economics, better payback than solar. So that's how they compare from that perspective. But in terms of their complementarity, wind and solar can work very well together under certain scenarios. And the general idea behind that is that the timing of production is different, both on the 24-hour basis, diurnal basis, but also on an annual basis. The chart on the right shows the monthly production of each of the technologies. The red line is the monthly production of a solar PV installation. The 6 months where it's really high, that's the middle of the summer, right? So it's just intuitive, it makes sense. Solar produces a lot more in the summer, doesn't produce nearly as much in the winter. The blue line is your wind turbine. Now, wind actually tends to be stronger in the winter months than in the summer months, and so it's actually a perfect inverse correlation with the solar production. And so, if your goal is to levelize the production at your facility, especially if you've got a constant electric load, you want to minimize the amount of electricity that you're exporting out to the grid because that's a lower value. And sometimes pairing with solar can do that. The same idea applies on a daily basis. Wind tends to be stronger at night. Well, not always, but often. Stronger at night. Solar, of course, only produces in the day, zero at night. So again, in terms of levelizing that production, it can be very interesting. All right. So what kind of projects can benefit from this? What kind of businesses? Well, really all kinds of scenarios. What is important is to have access, some land available, right? We need to ensure that there's the space to not only install the turbine, to bring it in, get it installed, but then of course have it be operational. You don't want to be located in a very dense area. If you've got homes right immediately next door, this kind of scenario that's probably too tight for a wind turbine. We're happy to take a look at it and let you confirm that suspicion. However, I'm just letting you know that space is still an issue. If you're in an industrial park or in a rural area, then it's you're much more likely to have the land available to do that. But in terms of profiles, really, it's anybody that needs electricity can benefit from this. We've assisted all types of businesses, mining operations, lots of farms, cold storage, all sorts of facilities. Let's take a moment to talk about how the process works, all right, and how long it takes. Overall, good rule of thumb is about 18 months, 14 to 18 months from the time that you initiate your first curiosity to the time that the turbine is spinning, all right? That process is handled by third parties. There's typically very little for you to do, but just for you to understand that timing, that's what we're looking at. Start off with a free screening of the project, right? Let's check the wind. Let's look at your electric bills. Let's dive into the usage. Let's look at the rates, see what the payback is, get a little report for you guys to be able to look at that. And then we'll look at the site, see what the land looks like, see where the electric meter is, just do some preliminary screening, make sure that it looks feasible at first pass. If that makes sense, move into the feasibility stage where it'll be a more formal review of the project. That typically takes about a month. The idea here is to spend as little money as possible to not only verify that the project can move forward, that you're able to connect to the grid, the utility is going to accept this project, other factors such as that one, the permits are looking okay. So spend as little money as possible and de-risk that project so that when we go ahead and move into the development stage where you actually go apply for the permits, or our partner does that on your behalf, in our case, and we'll move ahead with the engineering, you essentially know what you're working towards. That project development stage, the permits, a lot of it is applying for permits. That does depend on the entity that you're applying to. However, 3 to 6 months is a kind of a typical scenario that we see. The construction phase is actually quite fast, all right? So once you've got your permits, you wait for the turbine, there's a lead time on that. But when you get to the actual construction, we're talking about 1 to 2 weeks of actual construction time. So it's really very, very light, and that's in terms of assembling and erecting the turbine. There is some work ahead of time to pour your foundation, make sure that the access is there, and so on. But overall, it's actually very quick and a very little work. And then you move into the operations phase, which, as I mentioned earlier, there is an O&M contract for you that locks in your costs, and you can do that for the life of the project. Here's just an idea of the kind of things that we look at when we're screening this project and preparing a report for you. When we take a look at the wind resource, where it's coming from, times of year, strengths, that helps us calculate the specific energy output that you can expect at your site. And if the data is available with enough detail from your electric utility, we can even do an analysis to see very precisely what we predict the amount of electricity will be used on site versus used off site. So that's an offset analysis. And so this is just an example of the type of things that are included when you get involved in this wind project. Financing, let's talk about that. There are 3 main buckets. All right, you can purchase that turbine outright as an investment, benefit from the tax credits, do that with a loan or a cash purchase. But there are other options. There are leasing options out there. that some have some of the benefits of the purchase at times without requiring the capital outlay. And there are power purchase agreements where you only pay for the power that you purchase. And so that's typically the least amount of upfront investment, can be as little as zero. However, the benefits are certainly not as strong there because you've got an investor involved you'll have to share all the benefits with. But in certain circumstances, that can be the most appealing scenario. All right, EWT. I know this webinar is its primary purpose is really educational. However, I'll take a moment to talk about EWT and who we are. We are a global market leader in this space with projects all around the world. We are headquartered in the Netherlands, but have teams in multiple countries. I am based in the US, and we have projects around the world. And as I mentioned earlier, there are projects that can be done what we call behind the meter. All right, so this is the kind of projects where you're still connected to the grid and offsetting the power that you buy from the utility. But we also do projects in many remote areas. And one of the more exciting ones that I think we're doing right now is we've got 2 turbines on their way to Antarctica, to the McMurdo Research Station and New Zealand research stations. We're replacing some old wind turbines there to power the research station. So we do some fun stuff, but we also do lots of I would say more straightforward projects as well. Been around for 20 years. There are about 800 turbines operating out there here in North America. Many of those are actually up in the northern parts of North America, in Alaska and northern Canada. But we also have some down in the Midwest and the Great Plains areas as well. So with all that in mind, I'm going to open this to questions in just a minute. However, we can certainly encourage you, given the incentives environment right now, that if you are curious about this and want to have get some more questions answered, or have me take a more specific review and conduct a more specific review of your site, your location, your project, encourage you to reach out and to do so. So with that, Wendy, I will turn it over to you to open the floor to questions.
Well, first of all, Paul, thank you very much for a great presentation, and our attendees have certainly taken advantage of the Q&A panel, so thanks everybody. One thing I did want to remind everyone as we get started is this event will be archived on facilitiesnet.com/webcasts. In addition, you'll be receiving a copy of these presentation slides via email. Let's get into the questions, Paul. First one comes from Jim, and he's asking about the amount of credit you can expect. Is the amount you can expect connected to the area in the country and the amount of wind you're expected to get? Going back to that map that you discussed in that channel, maybe that's a question that could use a little more specificity.
Sure. So let me clarify that. So the federal tax credit is connected to the amount that you invested in the project. It is not connected to the wind resource. So if we're so 30% tax credit loan, again, I'll use just the example of our projects. If you're looking at a $3 million project, 30% tax credit is 30% of $3 million. Whether you have, in fact, if you had a poor wind resource and you decided to do the project, you would still get the 30%. So it's connected to that investment.
Okay, that's great. And that really helps clarify things. This gets a little more specific as well. For a second case study that you shared, the manufacturer claiming that REAP tax credit. And the question is, how is it possible for a manufacturer to take advantage of this if REAP is geared to the agricultural side?
Sure. Okay. So I apologize if that was not clear. So there are really 2 buckets of businesses that can benefit from the REAP grant. The first are agricultural businesses. If 50% or more of your production is agricultural, so that's an obvious one. Okay. The other one is rural small businesses, and small business as defined by the SBA. And that is something that we can help you look up if you're not sure how to do that. But if you are a small business and you are located in a rural area, which is defined as an area where the population is less than 50,000, then you can qualify. And as it turns out, actually, a lot of businesses do. I mean, I was just
Yeah.
looking at a manufacturing facility in Wisconsin that I'll be visiting actually next week. They have several hundred employees at their facility, but by the SBA, it still qualifies as a small business. So
Okay.
they do qualify for. So I would not be too quick to dismiss that grant, and that's why I put it in this presentation, because it's actually quite surprising how many businesses do qualify for that REAP
Yeah.
grant.
That's great. It sounds like there are a lot of lanes available for this kind of project. That's fantastic. Another question from Chuck. He's talking about O&M costs and contracts for owner CapEx funded projects in instances where the owner doesn't have the ability to maintain and repair the turbines. He's asking if there are some O&M services provided by EWT or someone else. And I know you and I,
Sure.
before the event started, were talking a little bit about maintenance protocols and things like that.
Mhm.
So I'll let you unpack all that.
Sure. Okay, great. So, well, first, let me clarify, and thanks for the question. Let me clarify that really there's no instance where the turbine owner would conduct the operations and maintenance themselves.
Right.
So that's something that is provided by EWT, and it's actually tied to the warranty. So the warranty is valid as long as the O&M contract is in place, and so that's as simple as that. Right?
Right.
Um, cost wise, as I showed in the model, it's about $40,000 per year. That's a specific quote we'll get for based on your location and your project, but that's pretty good, a good estimate, good rule of thumb. When calculating payback and all of those things, we'll include that in the report, so that you can see, the impact of that. Um, and it is considered. As I mentioned, it's actually very relatively minor piece compared to the income and the overall
Right.
investment that you're doing on a basis. I'll remind everyone that it's in our case, not all cases, but in our case, our O&M contracts include your scheduled as well as unscheduled maintenance. So it's a fixed cost, almost like an insurance plan,
Right.
so that you know exactly what you're going to pay for every year of the ownership of this turbine.
Right. All spelled out there. And in terms of ownership and length of ownership, two questions, two different attendees, but they want to know the same thing. The average lifespan of wind turbines. Any data that
Sure.
you could speak to on that?
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. So wind turbines have a 20 to 30-year life. Okay, and 20 really at a minimum. And our turbines are certified to all the American and global standards and engineering standards, um, which is always a minimum of 20 years. So that's the
Okay.
case. In practice, turbines typically last longer than that. And that's why we say 20 to 30 years. That depends to a certain degree on the characteristics of the wind at the site, right? If it's a very turbulent site, just no fault of your own, of course, but if it's just a little bit harder on the machinery, then it might be
Mm-hmm.
closer to 20 years. Where if it's a very, very steady wind, easy unidirectional, maybe closer to 30 years. So there's a little bit of variability there, but certainly 20 years for sure. And that's the way I always model that.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you were talking a little bit about wind and how that impacts operations and things like that. We've got a question. Somebody wants your opinion on a link for wind mapping. First of all, wondering if you have any resources, but also John shares one,
Mhm.
globalwindatlas.info/en.
Mhm.
Any insight into where people can go for some of this data?
Sure. Well, first of all, you can email me and I can we can
Great.
typically get a wind report to you within 24 hours, if
Okay.
not 48. So um, honestly, it's probably your best bet because we'll consider all the factors. But if you do want
Yeah.
a quick review, John's Global Wind Atlas link is actually one that can be used. You can look up your facility. Um, you have to, it's a little bit, there's a few factors to consider in terms of which wind layer you want to look at, and
Okay.
the elevation above ground. So I would be happy to guide you to so you could do that going forward. It's not too complicated, but it is a free resource and out there. And if you're a little bit handy, you can take a look at things. You're typically
Okay.
looking for your site to have an average wind speed of 6 meters per second average or more. That's what I'll be looking at. It might work if it's less than that. Maybe on a case-by-case basis, if you pay high electric rates, then it can still work. But just quick rule of thumb, that's the kind of wind speed that you'd be looking for.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the structures themselves. Paul wants to know, how do shorter vertical multi-directional wind turbines compare in terms of efficiency? And does that
Mhm.
have an impact on where you are in the wind at that spot as well?
Sure. So there have been many attempts out there at the well, yes, the question was multi-directional wind turbines, right?
Yes,
These are
there
like
you
sort
go.
of like spinning,
Yeah.
non-traditional looking type of wind turbines. Those really are still in research and development stages. There are none out there today that are certified to international standards. So if you want to take on a project with one of those, certainly it's 100% at your own risk. Maybe you want to support a business that's trying to get up and running, but certainly you would need to modify your expectations, because
Yeah.
to date, none of those have panned out. It's really been the more traditional three-bladed conventional design like
Hmm.
ours, that's used exclusively in any kind of commercial operation.
Yeah. Um, Stephen mentioned, says you talked about a partner for those permit applications when you're getting to that part of the process.
Mhm.
Is there a local service provider, or is there one specific company that offers this on a broader scale?
Mhm. Okay, so in our case, as the turbine designing and designer and manufacturer, we get the turbine built and to site. However, of course, for you, that's not very valuable. So we do have local partners.
Okay.
So in terms of who you would be working with, it would be a local partner who would offer you the turnkey service, everything from that feasibility report right through to construction and the commissioning of the wind turbine. We are there the entire time. We're assisting, and we're supporting the project, but it is a local partner that does that. Now I'll connect based on where you are and your situation. I'll connect you with the right one.
Okay. Um, Here's an interesting question, because I think as people are learning about this, there's an aspect to seeing things in action that could be very, very helpful and beneficial. Tim's wondering if there are any projects in development that are available to be viewed or inspected or toured um,
Mhm.
by others who are investigating this opportunity.
Sure, absolutely. We have several projects around the country. Would be happy to connect with you and
Great,
um, all of the turbines that have been installed. The owners I know will allow someone to come and take a look, and many of them will talk to you and tell them about their experience and so
great.
on. So it's certainly happy to do that.
Oh, that'd be a great opportunity. Tim, will make sure that Paul has information to connect with you on that as well. Um, Chuck's wondering if during the wind study, whether or not you look at shadow flicker, and has that had any impact on projects moving one way or another
Mhm.
and developing?
Sure. So shatter flicker, for those that want a little explanation of what that means, is when the turbine blades are spinning, and the sun is typically at a low angle on the sky, and the turbine is oriented, it happens to be oriented in the right direction, though the light shining through the blades can create a shadow on the backside, which as the blades are turning, creates this sort of like flicker sense, which would be annoying if it's, say, someone's home. Um, so to answer your question, yes, flicker studies are, well, first of all, we take a look and see whether they're required, right? Is there anything that might be impacted? And if so, then a flicker study can be done. Um, modern turbines like ours are certainly very sophisticated in the software and controls, and you can set it up such that in the event where the sun is in the right situation, the turbine's oriented the right way, that the turbine would not operate and that flicker wouldn't happen. So it'd be very specific, but we're able to do that nowadays.
Right.
So it's really can be mitigated.
Yeah, it sounds like it's an important box that you check off. That's
It's
fantastic.
one of the boxes.
Um, Tim is wondering, have your analyses ever shown you'd be better off taking production tax credits rather than investment tax credits?
Sure. Okay, so again, just a quick explanation for everyone here. The federal tax credit, there's actually two different types. There's one that's based on the investment tax credit is the one I described. It's based on the total investment on the project, 30% or more, as I described. There's another option where you can get a tax credit that's based on the number of kilowatt hours produced by that wind turbine. In these, we'll call them small projects, right? Distributed on-site generation, the production tax credit is invariably less lucrative than the investment tax credit, the one that I described, and that's why I only talked about the investment tax credit. I mean,
Sure.
there's virtually no scenario where you're not better off to take the investment tax credit. Those that do use the production tax credit tend to be the very large wind farms.
Okay.
Those wind farms these days are in hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and their cost structure is a little bit different, and the investor incentive and objectives are a little bit different. So for a variety, a few reasons, the production tax credit makes more sense. But this
Yeah.
is not, this isn't a large wind farm kind of development.
Right. Okay. That's great. That's a great and helpful
Mhm.
answer. Greg is wondering what is to be expected on the output end of these turbines in terms of voltage level, DC-AC conversion, and additional switchgear that may be needed.
Okay, so well, fortunately, we've got you covered on all of that. So,
Yeah, good.
um, what's included in the turbine is a full power converter. So it actually goes from AC to DC back to AC. But this is all included, and in the project design, there will be transformer that's included that will step it up or step it down to whatever voltage is required. That's all part of the design. So.
Okay.
Yeah, it's standard for all the electrical component piece to be included with this turbine. So
Okay.
we'll
Great. Thanks for that
make
answer.
make it easy.
We've got a couple more minutes and a couple more questions are still coming in. I'm wondering, Paul, if you could go back over the wind project comparison to a solar project in terms of efficiency, land usage, those kind of things.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, just as a reminder, in terms of efficiency, wind, when properly sited in a windy location, a 1 megawatt, let's just say, for example, 1 megawatt of wind,
Sure.
because we have a 1 megawatt wind turbine, will produce about 1.5 times to 2 times an equivalent amount of solar. So 1 megawatt of solar panels, we will outproduce them. So I typically will say, just for ease of math, is 1 megawatt of wind is the same as installing 2 megawatts of solar panels in terms of
Okay.
production output. And then from a land standpoint, that 2 megawatts of solar will require about 8 to 10 acres of land. So it's quite substantial in terms of space requirements. Gives you an idea of just how efficient wind is, and when you've got a good wind resource. Now it is very important that you do have that wind resource. And one of
Hmm.
the things that's interesting about wind, if you want to geek out for a second here, is that the amount of energy in the wind isn't linear. So as you, let's say, double the average wind speed at a site, you're not doubling the output. It's actually the square.
Hmm.
So it's very sensitive. It's very sensitive to the average wind speed. So that's why early on I talk about, hey, we check to see what the wind resource is at your site. Make sure that it's something that's going to make sense for you.
Absolutely. And Thanks for the chance to geek out on that. Maynard has pointed out that the North American Vegetarian Society has for decades been powered by wind turbine power in Dolgeville, New York. So, I mean, there are clearly some examples out there of long-term sustained savings and efficiency and sustainability that are, made possible by these kinds of projects. It's
It's
fantastic.
it's great to hear that. I haven't heard of that specific project out there. I know there are many out there. I mean, wind has been around for a long time. Um,
Yeah.
really since the 70s when some of the early wind turbines. There's been tremendous technological evolution, right? I mean, I talk about like the turbines going to Antarctica. I think they're from
Hmm.
the 90s. And honestly, I think there may as well be Model T Fords, right? I mean, there's just been
Right.
so much improvement. It's not that the old ones are so bad, but I mean, it's just you can't really compare. So that's kind of exciting because you just gets a lot more energy out of your wind, and the controls and the softwares, and this is now 24. We've got, I didn't mention this, but we've got 24/7 monitoring of the wind turbines from our
Wow.
control center. All of these things, and most of the events that happen on the turbine are automatically corrected. Those that are not are captured in the control room, and most times we can just fix things or press the reset button and off it goes, and you never even knew that, you don't even know did it happened,
Hmm.
and there's no impact. So
Wow.
it's pretty exciting. There's just a lot of fun stuff going on, and more to come.
Yeah. So we have time for, I think, one more question. I'm going to ask it, and I think it speaks a little bit to what you were just talking about, some of the advances and the upgrades that innovations have allowed the technology. Marcos is writing in from a community college sitting on a mesa adjacent to a bluff area where turbines could be installed. He's envisioning a smaller application powering the campus, and this is so exciting to me. I'm
Mhm.
geeking out, possibly creating an instructional program addressing the technology. So, like a twofer. But he's asking about noise considerations. And I would imagine, again, you've talked through some of the upgrades, improvements, and innovations in the technology. Let's talk about that piece of it too, and how things could work in a situation like that.
Sure, sure. So from a noise perspective, um, opponents of wind will used to point out the noise factor a lot more, and I don't even hear that as much anymore.
Mm-mm.
But the reality is that the acoustic profile of wind turbine is very low, right? Most of the time, it's not noticeable, and I encourage any one of you, if you've got a chance and you're out somewhere in the Midwest or near a wind
Yep.
farm, get out of your car, stop your car, open the windows, see what you can hear, right? The acoustic impact and the noise is in most instances very minimal. Now, that being said, if you're very close to a building, or there's something nearby that
Yeah.
maybe you want to investigate the impact, it's not ignored, right? Just like the shadow flicker,
Yeah.
we can take a look at that. It considers the prevailing wind direction, certain wind speeds. It's actually higher wind speeds, you tend to not hear a thing because the wind is just blowing. Um, so it depends on the sensitivity of that location, but honestly, in 99.9% of the situations, it's a non-factor.
Yeah. That's good to know. And so maybe we'll have an EWT university application coming up soon. That would be really interesting.
Sure.
A little more opportunity to learn about the technology. Well, I think we're at the end of our list of questions, Paul. But before we conclude today's event, just wondering if you've got a recommendation for next steps. Obviously, a lot of interest, a lot of opportunity. Where do our attendees go next to take the next step in this exploration?
Sure. So I think if you have a site, a location that now that you've heard this webinar, you think may have potential, simply just shoot me an email or give me a call. My information will be provided here,
Yeah,
and I will conduct a quick screening for you. That's typically very quick turnaround, and if we don't make sense, I can certainly point you in the direction of what might make more sense. Happy to to support the industry in doing so.
great. Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate the time for the Q&A. Super helpful, super specific, as well as a great overview of the technology and the opportunities that are out there for our facility professionals. To everyone who attended today, please know you will be receiving information via email with this presentation, as well as that contact information that Paul talked about. We also have contact information here on the screen as well. Feel free to utilize that and be sure to mention Paul in this presentation and your email over to EWT. And finally, I'd like to thank EWT for the support of this webcast and for a very important message for the facility professional community. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And with that, I'll conclude today's webcast.